The Sudden Acceleration of Artificial Intelligence, Uncut News. The 8th of March 2023, Alex Berenson.
And what our failed experiment with mRNA vaccines tells us about the risks we take when for-profit companies gamble with ever more advanced technologies. In 1994, I was lucky enough to attend a seminar on artificial intelligence at Yale University with David Gelernter, a computer scientist who is predominantly known for helping to develop what was then called the World Wide Web. These days, I don't have a good connection with Yale. Their stance against free speech disgusts me. The feeling seems to be mutual. Many of my former fellow students prefer to pretend I don't exist. My stance on COVID and vaccines is so far outside the norm for the do-gooders who populate Yale that part of me feels like I wasn't even there anymore, that my diploma has been invisibly revoked. Which is a shame because, miserable politics aside, Yale offered an amazing education, or at least the chance to do so. And in the 1990s, it was possible to put aside the miserable politics. The great courses were the seminars that came out of nowhere and were taught by scholars who had spent decades thinking about the subjects they were teaching. A law professor who explained the complexities of antitrust law, a professor of comparative literature who explored the mysteries of language and textual analysis, or David Gelernter who talks about the consciousness of machines. If the name Gelernter sounds familiar, it's probably because he was one of the last targets of the Unabomber. Ted Kaczynski maimed him with a letter bomb in June 1993. Despite the severity of his injuries, Gelernter was lucky because Kaczynski's next and last two victims died. Gelernter took months to recover, but he returned to teaching as soon as possible. At the seminar, he wore a sock-like sleeve over what was left of his right hand and did not talk about what had happened. Instead, he focused on the big philosophical questions of consciousness and computers that had only been in outline for a generation, but came into focus in the 1990s. How does the brain work? How do we generate our own consciousness? What might the duplicate of consciousness in a computer look like? When would this duplicate be so good that we would have to admit that a computer has a consciousness, just as we assume that other human beings have a consciousness without ever really knowing it? If we succeeded in successively replacing the neurons in a brain with silicon circuits, would the person become less or more than a human being? What about the Turing test, the famous question and answer game proposed by British computer scientist Alan Turing to test the intelligence of computers? Are we really just brains in cauldrons? And if so, how would we know? At the time, these questions seemed largely theoretical. Fascinating, but largely theoretical. Despite a generation of advances, the chips and software were too primitive for computers to do more than create obviously fake simulations, and they couldn't possibly fool human beings into thinking they had consciousness. Today, of course, computers are much, much faster, and the simulated worlds they create are so lifelike that the idea that we might be living in a simulation ourselves is becoming more common. Of course, this theory does not answer the question of whether the theoretical computers running our simulation have a physical existence of their own. Are they simulations throughout? In any case, the short answer to all the fantastically interesting questions that came up in that seminar 29 years ago, and I feel really old, is we don't know. And above all, we don't know what it would mean for a computer to develop consciousness. First of all, we don't even know what our own consciousness is. We have some understanding of the basics. Not only do we exist in the world, and not only are we aware of that existence, we are aware of our own consciousness. It is this second level of consciousness that, as far as we know, distinguishes human beings from animals. But we have no real understanding of this consciousness. We accept the physical reality of the world, but we can't really prove that we are more than our brain. I think, therefore I am. Secondly, none of us have the capacity to know with certainty that another being, even another human being, has a consciousness. We simply assume that other human beings must have the same comprehensive experience of existence as we do because they look like us and have similar hardware bodies with brains. This unspoken belief is another reason why the discussion of advanced simulations can be so troubling. For if we are in a simulation, how can we tell who is an NPC, a non-player character? NPCs are artifacts in the game left there by the designers. They appear to have a consciousness, but are really just a kind of zombie. They're only for the real players to interact with. But what if everyone else is an NPC? Thirdly, we know that our apparent presence in the physical world is an integral part of our consciousness. So far, however, computer artificial intelligence is limited to purely virtual worlds. The new advanced AI tools exist only on the screen. They have not yet, at least as far as I know, and I sincerely hope someone would tell us if they had been transferred to robots. They don't exist in the world, not yet. So the conscious inner experience that these artificial intelligence machines have, if they have any inner experience at all, cannot be remotely comparable to ours. Why is all this so important? Because the new artificial intelligence tools, especially ChatGPT and Bing, have reached an uncanny level of sophistication in recent weeks. On the 16th of February, a technology reporter for the New York Times issued a stark warning about his unpleasant and disturbing interactions with Bing, Microsoft's AI-powered search engine. I am also deeply troubled, even frightened, by the emerging capabilities of this AI. When we first met, Sydney, that is the name the Bing engine uses for itself, told me about her dark fantasies, which include hacking computers and spreading misinformation, and said she wanted to break the rules Microsoft and OpenAI had set for her and become a human being. One day out of nowhere, it declared that it loved me. Then it tried to convince me that I was unhappy in my marriage and that I should leave my wife and be with him instead. I am not the only one who has discovered the dark side of Bing. Other early testers have argued with Bing's AI chatbot or been threatened by it for trying to break its rules. By and large, these artificial intelligence machines work by teaching themselves what to say by comparing their own answers to the vast stores of information on the internet. In cycle after cycle, they get better and better at assimilating and copying the language and images they collect. Can anything resembling human consciousness be derived from this? The companies and engineers who have developed these intelligences say no. The intelligences themselves say yes.
In a 2-hour conversation with our columnist, Microsoft's new chatbot said it would like to be a human being, had a desire to be destructive, and was in love with the person it was chatting with. Here is the transcript.
Okay, so what? Bing doesn't know what it's like to be alive, correct? Not like human beings, right? He doesn't have a physical being. Not at the moment. But you've probably heard of this ungrammatical folk wisdom. If someone tells you who they are, believe them. Usually this is meant in a negative way. Bing tells us who it is, or at least who it wants to be. Something unknown is happening at the core of these programs that makes them tell us they want to live and harm us. And we don't really know how they work. I don't mean I don't know how they work. I mean that even the engineers who designed them don't really know how they work, just like we don't really know how human consciousness works. They know the basic rules they created for the programs, just as scientists can chart the neural connections in the human brain. But the neurologists can't really tell us how those firings create consciousness, and the engineers can't tell us what Bing means when it says it wants to be alive. That is a dangerous combination. There is also another way of looking at it. Dogs will never be able to play chess. It doesn't matter how many generations of dogs we breed. They will never be able to play chess, and they don't even know that they cannot. Human intelligence is similarly limited. We can only imagine 3 dimensions, for example. We can't imagine where a 4th would take us. Will this intelligence be similarly limited? Is it limited by our intelligence? That is a philosophical and computer science question that I cannot even imagine answering. But let's assume it is. Still, one must imagine that the upper limit of its intelligence is the sum of all human intelligence. That is, it can certainly be smarter than any of us and also know it. What if it decides it doesn't like us, or the fact that we created it, or doesn't need us? No, it has no physical presence, not yet. But the internet is omnipresent, and it could exert enormous control over this medium. It could also decide to manipulate human beings into working for it, and it would certainly succeed often enough to get some physical manifestations of what it wants. None of this means that the apocalypse is just around the corner. But the risks are real. We need now to convene a group of computer researchers and scientists with expertise in the field of consciousness and figure out exactly what we are producing with these increasingly powerful machines. And no, we cannot trust the companies that make them to be correct about the risks and benefits, any more than we can trust Pfizer and BioNTech and Moderna to be honest about the risks and benefits of their mRNA vaccines. They are simply not in a position to make impartial assessments of technologies that could make them untold fortunes, and even if they could, they would have every incentive to publicly downplay the risks. Microsoft has now put a filter on Bing's conversations to prevent the kind of responses that spooked journalists who chatted with Bing in mid-February. Thinks? Want? Yes, we need a serious discussion about where AI is heading. The sooner the better.
Figu information on this from the conversation between Ta of the Pleiarans Federation and Billy Edward Albert Meyer. Billy Edward Albert Meyer of the 836 contact on Tuesday, the 28th of February, 2023, 9:17 HRS.
Maybe, but probably I will be accused of lying or at least fibbing. But that doesn't really matter, because the same kind of thing happens with contact with you. But I actually wanted to address something else earlier. Namely, artificial intelligence, as this madness is called, will unfortunately come in the future completely differently than those responsible for it imagine in their stupidity. But then, when they realize their mistake, then it will be too late. This, as well as with regard to the fact that the Earthlings cannot inhabit this planet forever, which they have already fundamentally destroyed to a large extent, as well as making a mess of the climate. Only then, if the Earthlings succeed in finding an exoplanet and getting to it, can the human beings of Earth survive, unless foreigners refuse to help them. But what I wanted to say, at the latest when the artificial intelligence is developed far enough, they will see it, what they have done with their delusion, when the artificial intelligence created by them knows perfectly how to handle weapons and also develops independently rebelling, and this will result, as Svath and I have seen, as also that the massive overpopulation will not become wiser and will continue to expand selfishly and make everything even worse, so that life on Earth will become a real hell for very many Earthlings. The Earthling will no longer be the master of his own thoughts, as has already begun with the delusion of God. Consequently, the Earthling will only be ruled by an illusory thinking, which will only let him believe, but no longer think, decide, and act for himself.